How many of us in this room from time to time have become just a little bit too involved in our children's or our grandchildren's homework? Yeah? I could tell you that I'm guilty for sure. And about a week or two ago, somebody I know confided in me that he was disappointed when his daughter got a B on a paper that he did with her. And how many of us remember hanging out or have toddlers ourselves right now, or grandchildren who are toddlers, and we're in the park and a kid snatches a toy from our dear child, and we get in there and we intervene right away without letting them figure it out themselves? Again, I can tell you that I have been guilty. We are stuck in a parenting rut. You guys can hear me, right? Okay, if the microphone comes, let me know. We do too much. But isn't it our obligation, our responsibility to protect and to nurture our children to adulthood in this crazy, crazy world of ours? We no longer live in the romanticized days of yore where our children could ride bicycles freely, skate on the ice pond, etc., or even be left to do homework alone. Our kids these days, I don't know where Rory is right now, just can't mess up. We become a generation of over-meddling, helicoptering, and very anxious parents and grandparents. And our children, who sense our apprehension, are suffering. But what's our choice, right? We live in a day and age where we understand the vicissitudes of development too well to just let things go. We intervene immediately if our child isn't reading by the middle of first grade. After all, we don't want her to fall behind. It's too tough to grow up in this world, especially with the disadvantage. Testing, better? Thank you. Thank you. Now I don't have to scream. Growing up, that's okay, I'll hold it. Growing up in our world is hard enough. We don't want our kids to be at any disadvantage. As parents and grandparents, we have to continually be on high alert. So we don't have a choice. Still can't hear? Yeah, maybe this. That's okay. Just raise your hands if you can't hear, okay? Okay. There's somebody doing wonderful closed captions, so maybe we should have broadcast that, right? We just don't have a choice, or do we? In our 2009 book, Raising Children Who Soar, we put forth a new parenting model, one that we've been expanding and revising ever since. We suggest that children must not only be allowed to take risks, albeit healthy risks, but also be taught and encouraged to do so. We tried to turn the notion of risk-taking upside down and make it from what was a negative concept to a positive one. We say that healthy risk-taking is essential for a child's development and a vital part of parenting and grandparenting. We define healthy risk-taking as the ability to make those difficult, everyday decisions and choices. Those decisions and choices that get us out of our comfort zone and that stretch us. Healthy risks are made thoughtfully and carefully, not impulsively. When young children practice good risk-taking, they are not leaping into the unknown without a safety net, but building a bridge to avoid possibly devastating risks later on. We parents need to be familiar enough with normative child development to understand the risks that are essential at each stage of development. So what do risks look like? For a 3-year-old, it might be, especially for a shy 3-year-old, it might be to go to a friend's house for a play date. For a 7-year-old, it might be to sing a solo in a school chorus. For a young teen, it might be standing up for a child in her class who's being bullied. And for an older teenager, it might be working at a soup kitchen, even though her friends don't want to join her. While risk-taking moves a child toward growth, there's also the possibility of failure and disappointment. Failure in and of itself is not the antithesis of good risk-taking, but one component and one possible result. I suggest that experiencing small disappointments and failures over time inoculate our children and help them to develop resilience, good decision-making skills, and take pride in their achievements. Good risk-taking is a thoughtful action. We have also found through research and clinical case study that in contrast to good risk-taking, bad or impulsive risk-taking is a behavior that emerges without judicious and careful thought, feeling, and action. Poor risk-taking may have self-destructive components, and the primary impetus is not toward growth. An example of this would be a 10-year-old who takes a friend's dare and skateboards without a helmet. Human beings take and avoid good risks from the time we can crawl, probably even before, from birth, I should say. Some of us are more prone to risk-taking, and other of us are more cautious. This is due to temperamental variation. But our temperament doesn't predict whether one will be a good or poor risk-taker. All of us can become good or risk-takers over time. So when a baby gets up on all fours for the first time and takes her first movement forward, she's taking a risk. Many risk-taking behaviors, like crawling, unfold predictably with development. Some do not. That's why it's important for parents to understand that there are different ways in which we, as adults and our children, approach risk, and that one's approach to risk is influenced by a number of components, which I'll discuss in a moment. But before delving into this specifically, it's important to emphasize that while parenting healthy risk-takers is drastically different than being a hovering parent, it is not a laissez-faire parenting style. Rather, raising a healthy risk-taker, a child who takes pleasure in challenging himself, who is independent, critical thinker, and kind to others, takes a lot of hard work, as I think we all know in this room. So the aim of this talk is to leave with a blueprint toward using a more relaxed, more attuned, and less hovering mode of interaction with your child or grandchild. So the story begins with our relationship with our child during infancy. Attachment to the primary caregiver happens as early as 4 months. We develop bonds of trust and of safety, and this happens naturally for most of us as we feed and coo and nurture our infant. But for this bond to develop well, it is crucial that we listen carefully and we pay close attention to the signals that our baby is sending us. This way, we set the stage for creating good risk takers. Now, I must have a caveat here. This doesn't mean that we have to be 100% attuned or do it 100% well. We need to be good enough, and as many of you in this room know, Donald Winnicott, a beloved psychoanalyst and pediatrician, talked about good enough parenting. We just need to be attuned enough. So from observing and listening to our baby, we can learn much about her temperament. Is he easygoing, or does he tend to be rigid, self-contained, or more gregarious, focused, highly focused, or distractible, even keeled or volatile, cautious or impulsive? We learn from listening to our baby what's easy for them and what's more difficult. Again, caveat, all of this is on a continuum. It's not an either-or sort of thing. As we set the stage for listening well to our children, it's super important that we try our very best not to be judgmental. We also need to pay attention carefully as to how temperamental style interacts with ours. And to do this, we need to understand ourselves better and to self-reflect. So I'm going to tell you a story about my own eldest son, Jake, who is now 33 years old. And he is the father of 2 children. He's doing a really nice job. He and his wife are doing a nice job of being parents. But this is a great example, I think, some self-disclosure. I'm primarily a clinician, so I usually don't talk about my own life, but I thought that this might be apropos. Anyway, Jake was 18 months old at the time. And I noticed from the beginning, of course, that his temperament and my temperament weren't very much the same. I tend to be a risk taker. I go for it. I tend to be more impulsive. Jake, on the other hand, more cautious, more careful, observer. So we didn't match so well, right? I mean, Jake didn't walk until he was close to 14 months, and when he got up, he ran across the room. I'm sure some of you in this room have kids like that. Anyway, one day we were at the playground, and he was learning how to climb up the ladder of the slide, and he was making sure everything was just right. Finally, he got to the second rung, and he was kind of proud of himself, and in runs a little girl and her mom. The mom is an acquaintance of mine, didn't know her that well, and the little girl came running up to the lower rung and started to climb up the ladder where Jacob was sort of frozen. And Jacob screams, "No D baby, no D baby." And the mother said, she was kind of a little arrogant anyway, she goes, "My child is not naughty. What's wrong with your son?" So, of course, Jacob wasn't saying naughty baby, he was saying no D, not this baby. He just didn't talk so well yet, you know. He finally learned how to talk. So what did I do? I very quietly apologized. I have some friends in the audience here who know. I kind of quietly apologized and said, "Come on, Jake, let's go over to the swings. It's okay, honey." Well, I should have been more, I had a lot of self-reflective work to do. First of all, I didn't need to apologize for Jake's temperament. I didn't need to apologize for the fact that our temperaments don't match. What I could have done, of course, was spoke quietly to the mom and said he wasn't saying naughty baby, he was saying not this baby. It takes him a little bit more time, and give it a break here, you know? But I didn't. And I didn't speak to Jacob afterwards either. And this is something I explain to my patients, to the parents of my patients all the time, that you can explain things to your children, to your young children, simply and honestly. And again, you set the stage for development and for taking good risks. So I had a lot of self-reflective work to do. In our book, the ongoing practices of self-reflection and listening well are key. Let's look quickly at figure 3.1, the self-reflection checklist. And in our book, we've got a lot of these. Self-reflection is a process, right? So I'm just going to go through a bit of it here. So we need to ask ourselves, is my child's behavior triggering? Does everybody see it? Page 65, figure 3.1 at the top. Is my child's behavior triggering uncomfortable feelings like anger, anxiety, fear? Yeah, I mean, I was anxious and I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. Why is this behavior triggering these feelings? Well, again, there was some expectation that especially a little boy, and we have gender expectations too, should be out there climbing up the slide at 18 months, and some little girl shouldn't be pushing him around. Is this a familiar feeling or unexpected feeling? Well, actually, this was one of the first times it happened, and I was, you know, it was a great learning experience for me. So anyway, I won't go through this whole checklist, and it's one of many in our book, but through the process of self-reflection, we can really learn to understand our children's temperament better and what matches or mismatches with ours. The other thing that we often recommend for this process is to keep a journal of self-reflection. And through journal writing, you can often get some answers that you don't get just by kind of thinking out loud or not out loud about yourself. Let's take one other example from my practice. From an early age, Michael was lauded for his academic accomplishment. His parents, his teachers, he was always at the top of his class. And he, sorry, thank you. And, I like to gesticulate, hold my hand back here. And he received a lot of approval for that. His daughter Claire had some early language difficulties, and when she started school, she had some problems with reading. I mean, we've got a lot of educators in this room. I mean, it's not unusual. And Michael was very, very gung-ho in helping her. And, but what happened was these interactions around the homework, around her schoolwork, were often frustrating for Michael when Claire couldn't get it as quickly as he expected. So he came to my practice at the point when he said his home was like a mini war zone because they were screaming at each other so much. And we started talking about these issues of temperament and so forth. And I helped him to begin to self-reflect. And he realized, what he said to me was, I never realized that I needed to accept Claire, or I need to accept Claire for who she is, for her strengths and her weaknesses, not for whom I want her to be. And this is so simple, and it's something that, people kind of say all the time, but it's so much harder to do, to separate ourselves in one way from our expectations with our children. And one way to do it is to really look carefully at our temperamental variations and match and mismatch. So, it is equally important to learn how to listen to our children. A child who is heard becomes a healthy risk taker. But don't we listen all the time? I mean, everybody in this audience knows that we don't. Listening takes practice. We need to start when our kids are babies, i.e. that example about the crawling before. And often, when we think we're listening, we're not actually listening. We're multitasking, we're thinking about tomorrow's business meeting or lesson plan. Whatever it is, our children deserve to be heard and need to be heard fully. It's important to find some time every day to practice listening to our children without doing anything else. Now, we're all really busy professionals in this room, and that takes time, right? I mean, who has time to do this? Well, first of all, it's a very important investment, and second of all, it doesn't necessarily take so much time. You have to figure out the right sort of venue for it. So for a toddler, for example, maybe after his nap, when they're just kind of getting up and they're all warm and cozy, it's time to just kind of listen, about what went on in nursery school, or what he's thinking about, or even the dream that he had. Be careful not to interpret it, of course. A dream he had while he was sleeping. For teenagers, the best time to listen is any time we could catch them and they're willing to open their mouths. But for my kids, I felt that late at night, it's a good thing I'm a night owl, that worked pretty well. Just kind of be sitting there waiting until one of the kids came down for a snack or something, and then inevitably they would talk. Let's go over this listening checklist briefly, and that's page 84, figure 3.5. And again, this is really just an introduction. This is something that takes time and thought, but you can get a sort of an overview. Begin by an assessment of the current state of how you listen to your child. For example, when your child asks you a question or engages you, do you find your mind wandering? Do you get annoyed by the amount of time that it takes for your child to ask the question or to get out what he's trying to say? It's really important that we be honest with ourselves. Practice listening to your child without making any judgments. It's something that I said before. Pay attention to what your child leaves out, as well as to what he says, and it's not I think everybody knows in this room, just the words. It's the body language, it's the tone, it's so much. It's not just listening with words, it's listening sort of with our souls. When you initiate a conversation with your child, a light touch works well. Not too many questions. I mean, in my practice, I see a lot of teenagers, and I'd say one of the biggest gripes teenagers have about they gripe about everything, of course, but you got to take it with a grain of salt. But one of the biggest gripes is, you know, I really want to talk to my mother or father, but they ask me so many questions and they're relentless. So you really have to time it. Light touch. If your child is sort of pulling away, no, now's not the time. If it's a particularly sensitive issue or topic, maybe approach it in a different way later. You know, use just some common sense. Like my grandmother used to say, some seichel, you know, some common sense about how to speak to your child. I'm going to skip down, but the last point is, as Atticus Finch said in To Kill a Mockingbird, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And that's really the aim for beginning to listen well. Okay, my computer just went to the beginning here. Hold on. Okay, I have another example. Another example from my practice. Katie is a little girl and her mom. So her mom, I refer to her as her mom was practicing listening skills for a long time and really had become a wonderful listener. And Katie's mom was in the car going to pick up Katie from school. She was in 5th grade at the time. And Katie was about 50 or 75 feet away. And her mom noticed just from the first second that there was something about Katie's posture that day that looked a little bit different, a little hunched over or whatever. And Mom was already thinking. And as she approached, she saw that Katie looked a little pale and not quite herself. So her mom was sort of forming all these hypotheses even before Katie got into the car. And forming hypotheses like this kind of opens us up and makes us ready to listen and to hear. And Katie finally got into the car, and remember I said about a light touch, you know, Katie's mom would say, so what happened? What's wrong with you? And you know, and totally barrage her. No, she didn't do that. She kind of, you know, was kind of readied herself, and she was prepared and more balanced herself, so she didn't need to be overwhelming to Katie. So kind of quietly and empathically, Katie's mom said, hey, what's up? She didn't say another word. And it took about, I don't know, she described it to me, 3 or 4 minutes, something like that. And Katie's mom said that was interminable for her, that she was just waiting and not saying a word. And finally, Katie burst into tears, and she said, a bunch of girls bullied me today. It wasn't physical, it wasn't fighting, it was with words. And she went out and she spoke about it to her mom. And her mom didn't say a thing. She just listened carefully. And finally, when Katie was done, she said, that must feel horrible. And we're going to figure out what to do to make you feel less bad and more safe. She said, Katie said, I don't want to go back to school. I hate it. Those girls are horrible. They made fun of me. They blah, blah, blah. So the reason I tell this story is particularly poignant for me. It resonates with me because it's an example of how we, maybe I'm covering this. Sorry. Can't gesticulate. Gotta stand still. We as parents need to understand our role in all of this. I have a patient right now who says to me, as long as I get the problem solved, I'm done. Understand, get the problem solved, done. It's not that easy. This takes time and thought, And so anyway, to go back to Katie and her mom, they kind of finished the conversation, and later on, after Katie had had a snack and things seemed to be a little bit better, Katie's mom said, so we need to think about, what's going to make it easier for you to get back into school tomorrow. And she also talked about her anger with, feeling that she was bullied and these girls were unfair, et cetera, et cetera. And they finally came around that this wasn't Katie's job to figure out a plan. It was Mom's job, and she did. Finally, they called the school psychologist in the evening, made a plan for the two of them to come in together, and then it was handled thoughtfully from there. Now, listening well doesn't only help with understanding your children. Can help with loads of other relationships as well. I see couples in my practice as well, and it can really, Dr. Ruth is sitting here, listening well, right, to your spouse, to your partner, is super, super important for communication. Raising good risk takers also requires that parents and grandparents understand child development and typical risks at various ages and stages. And I'll just touch on this briefly so we have some time for questions and answers. But look at table 2.1 in your packet, page 53. In our book, we talked about typical risks and what typical actions were at different stages of the game. So, for example, let's take a type of risk of mastery, right? It's hard to get out there and master things. So if a child is utilizing good risk-taking skills, something like drawing a person might be hard. I have many kids, in my practice say, I can't draw, I'm not good at drawing. So drawing a person is something that is a healthy risk. Or riding a tricycle or a two-wheeler for an older child. Poor risks would be something like scribbling on the wall, or not participating during music time or circle time, or running across the street. How many of our toddlers, have tried to do that? Run across, they're running, and that's a bad risk. So it's very important, for example, when we're walking with our toddlers, to teach them the limits and the boundaries in terms of safety. That's what I always say, to my little granddaughter, safety first. That's the only thing I'm gonna, kind of get on you for. And we're walking down the street. She was on her, scooter yesterday, and she was zooming way ahead of me. And we have a code together and a freeze, and so she hears that really loudly, and she just stops on the button. And it's not only a good risk, but it makes her feel competent. It makes her feel in control. Think how much worse it would have been, not only if she had crossed the street, but if we had had a big fight over, when to stop and when not to stop. So clear limits and boundaries are super important. Looking just quickly at the table for 5 to 10-year-olds, which is the next page. I think it's the next page in your packet. Again, something like the risk of social connection. As I mentioned before, something like asking a new friend over versus gossiping about a new child in the class. So these risks, as we talk about in the book, unfold over time, and it's really our role and our responsibility to direct, to guide our children in a way that they move toward good risk-taking behavior and not bad. When Susan and I wrote this book, we were really surprised that how few books there were on good risk-taking, almost none. There's books about resilience and so forth and so on, but all the risk-taking, almost all, there's some wonderful academic literature actually in sociology and anthropology about positive risk-takers, and if anybody's interested, I could talk more about that at some point. But there was almost nothing in the vernacular about positive risk-taking and the importance. It's important to notice that what constitutes a risk for one child is different from another. And for some kids, going over to a friend's house may be easy. It's not really a risk. And for others, it is a very big risk. But all children can become healthy risk takers no matter how they are wired. And we can facilitate healthy risk taking by practicing to be more self-reflective ourselves, by learning to listen well to our children's cues. So a few take-homes. 1, rather than hover, observe. Think of yourself as a safety net, not a helicopter. Watch carefully, but don't do it for your child. Through their independence, I won't repeat that. Through their independence and their mess-ups, believe me, I'm a parent and grandparent, I know. It's easy. My son said to me, "You're gonna preach that again, you know?" They'll truly learn to take pride in their own achievements and keep rising to greater challenges. 2, pay attention to the signals, subtle and obvious, the signals that your child is sending you, so you can really step in when you need to. Take Katie's mom, for example. 3, become familiar with how your child pushes your buttons and why. When in doubt, bounce things off of your partner, friend, professional. It often takes a village, as we know. Think of Michael and Claire. 4, when your child experiences failures and disappointments, think of these as emotional growing pains. Without them, he won't be well inoculated to take on future challenges. 5, play with your child and be playful. And I don't just mean your preschooler. You can be as playful with an 8-year-old, adolescent, or a grown child by helping them to find joy and humor in the daily grind. So, observe, reflect, listen, stay close by, but give them enough room to flop and to soar. So, I think we have time, definitely have time for questions. Yes, darling, speak loud so I could hear.
I have good projection. Well, in your practice, the whole idea of do you deal with competition, the idea of competition and parenting? Because with such, I mean, we have old children, but it seems to me, looking at where parents are now with young children, what I see when I work with these families.
Louder, less.
What I see when working with these families where I volunteer as a teacher, that the competition amongst parents for a child, their child to be the most successful, so that each man for themselves would inhibit risk-taking, encouraging risk-taking in one's child, because it's all about the parent and their success in having a successful child. So do you work with this with parents in your practice a lot?
Yeah, of course, of course. And maybe other people in the room are interested in commenting on this as well. You know, this kind of grows out of that example about Michael. You know, we see a lot of competition about where our kids are going to school and how they're doing, and later on what jobs they get, and so forth and so on. And to me, not just to me, I mean, theoretically, this really comes from sort of a narcissism within the parents. And what I try to do, and I try not to use this psychobabble, but what I try to do in my practice, again, it's sort of self-reflection, is to help parents really separate out what is their issue or issues, and what the child is capable of. So if a parent, let's say, never quite made it in, I don't know, whatever field it is, let's say law or medicine or banking or education or any of these fields, so through their own deficit and weakness, they're going to want to compete more, or maybe there are other feelings of insecurity and inadequacy. So in my practice, I deal with this really from sort of a deep way, a deep psychological way. But I think that there's also a huge cultural overlay. You know, we live in New York City and we work in New York City, and the reality is this is a super competitive place. And I think all of us have to keep reminding ourselves, you know, about the inevitability of competition. And again, we could turn it upside down, because competition in and of itself can be a good thing, you know, can be a really good thing. You know, being a competitive runner kind of urges us on to maybe win the race, you know, as opposed to somebody else. So really have to think whether this is from sort of a good and a healthy place or negative. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very common. I was just going to ask that, like, in that moment on the playground, because everybody is, you know, I feel that I have a 17-month-old, and so we're just starting to sort of experiment with, you know, she's got agency, and she knows what she wants to do, and when she's with her little friends, you know, I don't like to necessarily intercede, but oftentimes other parents will be like, no, that's Levi's ball, give it to him, you know, like, versus them trying to figure it out.
Right.
So I think there is kind of this competition, like my kid's more well behaved, or my kid's more advanced, or my kid's, you know, that sort of thing. And I guess my question is more practical around that, sort of how do you engage the other parent in a way that doesn't sound sort of
pedantic,
yeah.
yeah.
Or like, yeah, too academic, to be like, let's give the kids their space so that they can be developmentally appropriate. And, you know, so what are some tactical things in that moment?
I tell you, it's so tough. Last night we were having a conversation, it's not the same exact thing, but about people on the bus not giving up the front seat for people who are disabled. And it was so interesting to hear people's views last night. One person said, I just push them over. One person says, I stare them down. The other person said, you know, I kind of say politely, blah, blah, blah. Somebody said, I don't do anything. So I think this is, you know, it's tough. It's really, really, really tough. And, you know, especially as educators, it's hard, you know, we can't come up like, I know it, you know, I know what to do. So I gotta tell you something interesting, and this is from experience. I see my eldest granddaughter every Thursday, and this has been since she was born. She's 3 years old, and I have now made friends with some of the moms and kids, and so I'm going on play dates again with toddlers. And one very practical piece of advice is I choose parents carefully. I know that's bad, but I must admit it. But obviously sometimes we're in the park and, you know, you get these kinds of situations. And I think the way to do it is kind of like what I tried to do but didn't do very well with Jake when he was 18 months old. You know, I think it's good if another parent intervenes to sort of, you know, model the very best you can. You know, to say something like, Levi, is your son saying? Yeah, you know.
The friend is. My daughter's Cleo.
Okay. You know, I wonder if the kids could, let's try to see if the kids could work it out this time. You know, just sort of very quietly and simply. Or, you know, just sort of do it through action sometimes, depending on the example. Or, you know, even I know that the kids, even at this age, can do it. And again, to go back to your child and talk about these altercations, I mean, or, you know, interactions, I should say. You know, for them to know that they have the strength to do it, never to split and say, God, could you believe that mom did that? But, you know, say, hey, that was really good the way you tried to blah, blah, blah. So I think, you know, the problem with all this is it's not one size fits all. And it takes thought. It takes thought, and it depends on the situation. It depends on, you know, the capability of the child and all that. Yeah.
So this is kind of along the line also of one size doesn't fit all. The question has to do with, there are certainly families who grow up in environments in the city where life is a whole lot riskier. I'm wondering, you know, part of that is there sort of, in the literature, there's been this emphasis of authoritative versus authoritarian versus laissez-faire parenting, which is the so-called best, right? So I'm wondering how your work informs parents who are in these situations where you really have to be more in there because the risks are different depending on what surrounds you.
That's a really good question. Did everybody hear that? Okay, so if I'm going to paraphrase, tell me if I don't do it properly. There are a lot of kids in this city and other cities around the world that are really in more risky neighborhoods and situations where the dangers can be a matter of life and death, etc. And in the parenting literature, traditionally there are 3 types of parenting styles: laissez-faire, authoritarian, and authoritative, right? And how does this, thank you, how does this fit into our model? So I would say, interestingly, if I were to have to pick one of those 3 categories, I would say authoritative, not authoritarian, of course. So, you know, we set firm limits and boundaries. We set limits for safety. We set limits for anything that could be harmful emotionally. It's not just a laissez-faire thing, but it doesn't come across in a really authoritarian way, right? So, yeah, I mean, that sort of makes sense. And you know, it's interesting because I work in a lot of underserved neighborhoods and communities, and I've worked with a lot of underserved families. And the model isn't much different, you know? I mean, that's something that, it may be surprising, but, you know, that's something that, that I really wouldn't have said 20 years ago. We need to look at their strengths, we need to look at the real dangers, the safety dangers, etc. Let me give you an example rather than being general. And I was just talking about this with a principal in an underserved school this week. When I was a doctoral student here, and I was a research assistant, we were doing some work, like, you know, the dinosaur days. We were doing work in some underserved schools, and it was my job as a good research assistant to have the kids go through these protocols. You know, it was a cognitive study, blah, blah, blah. So, and I wasn't trained as a clinician at that point. And I went up to my little testing room through these urine-smelling hallways, and a boy was sitting there, 6th grader, bigger than I at this point, and he was tapping a TV antenna, you know, like very aggressively on the desk. And you know, I smiled and said, "You ready to do this little protocol, you know, blah, blah, blah." And he kept like going like this. Finally, I put the damn protocol down and I said, "So what's up?" He goes, "Lady, you wouldn't want to do this if your house burned down yesterday." So obviously I wasn't in the position to do a full intervention. Of course, I brought it to the attention of the people, etc. But what I did with him that day was, I'm not going to make him into a good risk taker in day 1, but what I did that day is listen to him, understood, you know, that he wasn't anywhere to be able to perform, you know, academically or you know, in this particular thing. And likewise with the parents, I think ongoingly, we run parenting groups here, you know, with lots of in lots of underserved communities where there's real risk and danger. And they talk about it, they talk about the way in which it resonates with them, what are the limits, what are the boundaries, what are our children's strengths. Some of our kids don't have the strength and the wherewithal sort of genetically to keep up with this. How do we build that? And so we talk about that in a clinical way. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes?
I have a 3 and a 4-year-old.
Okay.
And the other day I had them at one of those indoor playground kind of spaces.
Yeah.
And they had an area set up where parents could sit while the kids played because there wasn't too big. And I was the only parent sitting in the parent. Every single parent was in that playground. Exactly. And I actually felt bad. Like I was like, am I supposed to be in there? But I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect. I know so many parents that are kind of tired of this, cover generation and want to see it move, but then in practice, they're still kind of on the top. I'm just curious if you see the pendulum sort of shifting. There seems to be this frustration developing within the parent community of why can't we just let our kids
Be.
Yeah.
Be. Such a good point and such a good question. I was really hoping that the helicoptering generation that would begin to switch, to shift, that the pendulum would be shifting. I don't see it, I mean, taking just, this isn't research data, but just taking informal, surveys in different communities, not only here, but all over, when people, come and interview me for my book, etc., and they might be out in the Midwest or the South or whatever, it's really all the same. And I think we brave parents, we need to take a risk. I think you guys were both saying this. We need to take a risk to know that we don't need, that we can be safety nets and not helicopters, And I think there's a different situation. For example, if you're in one of these rooms and there's not too many kids and there may be staff there, your child is safe. He's not going to run out. He's not going to fall between a crack. He's going to be okay. Let him be. And, don't go overboard saying, I'm so proud of you. You were the only child who didn't have a parent there. Good job. What was that like for you, There are situations where we do have to make sure that, again, I'll use a personal one. The day before yesterday, I was with Rowan in the park. I don't know if anybody knows the park on 67th Street on the east side, but there's this if you have kids, grandkids, you got to take them. There's this fabulous slide that's kind of built into a little hill, and the kids kind of have to walk up this little nature path, and then it's a huge slide that comes down. And some of the children take to walking up the sides of the slide. It's kind of like modified rock climbing, but it could be a little dangerous. Rowan's just 3. I'm like the oldest person to be running after her, because the truth is that she could fall. And I didn't want to tell her, no, you can't do that, it's too scary. She felt that she wanted to copy the big kids, and she did it. And she was successful, but I was standing close by. But in that kind of situation, like, really? That's their problem. Yes?
Yeah, grandparents and how you support to your daughter-in-law and son when you're at a distance. We don't always live nearby.
Uh-huh.
So what are some suggestions that you can give so that we can help our grandson?
Not interfere too much?
Pardon me?
Not interfere too much?
Not interfere. We're at a distance, long distance travel-wise. We don't live nearby.
Uh-huh. Do you live in driving distance, or?
No, we don't. Well, we're back and forth from Vermont to New York. But, right now, I live in New York, but my husband lives in Vermont. So we're here and there, but eventually we will be in Vermont majority of the time. So I just wanted to know what are the best ways for us.
And your daughter-in-law is living in Vermont or elsewhere?
They
Elsewhere.
live here in
Uh-huh. I see. So I'll make sure I understand your question. What is the best way to offer support as a grandparent when you're not nearby?
Right.
Okay.
Plug in every now and then, so you miss a heck of a lot.
Say that again?
Plug in every now and then, holidays, summer, whenever you get to go. Particularly if you're the father's mother, whenever you can, you go. And so it gives that extra dimension of being sensitive to all that's happened since the last time you saw us.
Yeah. I think it's, thank you. Maybe other grandparents or parents who experience grandparents could talk about this. It's, again, it's hard for me to answer this question really, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. It so depends first on your relationship with your daughter, your daughter-in-law, son, son-in-law, whatever. And this is something that I've been super interested in since I've had in-law children is thinking carefully about the relationship and forming it and being honest with one another and figuring out what their needs are. I'm not sure that it happens just at the time, of birth. It happens, before that. And, I know for myself, I'm always kind of fighting, like you're saying, I want to be there all the time, but it's just, you've got to hear what's best for them and hope that they're going to give you an answer that's honest, I also think that family vacations are a wonderful way to spend time with extended family, especially if you're far away. Go ahead.
Related to that, and I know.
A little louder.
Oh, really? Why? This is Pandora's Box, and if you could just give me some ways to go to find out. One of my grandchildren is gender dysphoric,
Uh-huh.
and that just raises all kinds of extra need to protect, issues inside.
Yeah.
I think that my son and daughter-in-law are magnificent about this and trying to do everything. And in a way, one size does fits all because only because the principle has been given us. You translate into it, and I'm sitting here doing that, interpreting what this means for this child.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So I got that term from the NIH.
Oh, yeah?
Dysphoria, and I like it so much better than anything else because it says, first of all, the kid is confused
Uh-huh.
about society, about himself, and doesn't even realize, and that gives you an extra dimension of having to listen
Uh-huh.
to what's bothering and why he's acting the way he is.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry.
And so,
But if you could just tell me.
yeah, no, continue.
I think I should go back to the NIH and see.
It's an NIH report or document?
Research on gender dysphoria.
Uh-huh.
actually.
Uh-huh.
And,
Maybe you'll send me the link. I'm always interested. Yeah, and so you're using this for using this with your grandchild who's gender dysphoric. How old is he, she?
7.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And is this something you
And
do?
he wants to soar. That's why I came here. He is a gymnast. He literally, physically wants to soar. So.
And is this something that, taking, 5 minutes, okay, taking your question from the woman on the other side of the room, is this something that you talk about with the parent of your grandchild?
They are meticulously.
They are what?
They are meticulously
Uh-huh.
watchful about this.
Good.
And try not to be that extra authoritative.
And it's harder with a child who's gender dysphoric at a young age.
And he's got a brother who's not.
Uh-huh.
An older brother.
Well, that's very typical. That's very typical.
So I'm almost as worried about it.
Yeah, it sounds very good. Yeah. Yeah, our world is, in many ways, it's kind of sad in the way our world is more complicated, but in these kind of ways for expression of gender and sexuality and whatever else, it's wonderful that we understand so much more and we can make a difference in terms of development, and the child doesn't have to hide who he or she is for such a long time. Yes.
What you're saying really aligns with how I see parenting.
Uh-huh.
But I've heard people around me that don't necessarily see things the same way.
Uh-huh.
How would you articulate the importance of doing it this way? Why is this so important?
Why
What would
is
you say?
raising kids the way I'm talking about important?
Right. What is it offering children? What is not doing it?
Okay, so I could hopefully try to say it in a sentence. Let's see. I think that this model, which is, I hope, an integrated model from some of the different parenting styles that have worked in the past, provides our children with the best chance of expressing who they are, for finding their own resilience. Take a child who's gender dysphoric, but able to take a risk, little risks at a time in his community or her community. That's more than a sentence already, oh gosh. To rise to challenges, to be able to rise to challenges, to take pride in their achievements so that they want to do it again, to not be afraid to fall, but yet at the same time to feel safe and bounded. I hope that does it. Final question. Oh gosh, okay, back there.
When adults are playing games with children,
What is that?
when adults are playing games with children,
Yeah. What about?
letting them win versus
I had a little trouble hearing. Say it again.
when adults are playing
Games with children.
do you let them win?
Oh, okay. Okay. Now, you're not going to be surprised with this answer. It depends. We could talk more about it. Thank you, everybody.